of The Nation magazine, and he has a recent piece writing about this very process called Bankers Lobbied for Deregulation, Congress Capitulated, and now banks are collapsing. John Nichols, great to have you back. Thank you for taking the time.
It's great to be with you, and what a well-chosen intro to this conversation.
Sometimes I luck out.
Like on the day. Yeah.
Right. We planned this yesterday or 2 days ago. John, what was the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act?
It was the dream of regional bankers, for lack of a better term. And frankly, the dream of a lot of bankers and banking lobbyists. You have to go back to 2007, 2008, when we had the bank collapse in the United States and really a global banking collapse. It was an incredible crisis, a disastrous situation. It was one of those circumstances where the collapse wasn't just in the banks, it spread very quickly into the broader society. And so you had a financial crisis, financial services crisis, that became an unemployment crisis, a jobs crisis, a growth crisis for the country. Barack Obama, when he came in as president in January of 2009, he inherited a disastrous situation. It had, you'd had government interventions already, but it was clear that there was going to be ongoing challenges. So and after the immediate response to that crisis and the recognition that this was a very big political issue, Congress decided to act. And they had a lot of space in which to act. Obama came in with a very strong Democratic majority in the House and the Senate. So it should have been very easy to do New Deal style banking regulations. Unfortunately, the banking lobbyists were not about to let that happen. And so they rushed in with a lot of pressure. They hired a lot of former Democratic members of Congress, and they lobbied hard. And they got a Dodd-Frank bill that was strong in some ways, but that had a lot of vulnerabilities, had a lot of openings that could ultimately be exploited in the long term. And so it's important to start with an understanding that Dodd-Frank was not the solution to all the problems. Some very good members of Congress, people like Russ Feingold, had big questions about Dodd-Frank, challenged it. Some Democrats voted against it because they did not think it went far enough. But it became the law of the land. And for a time, it did, put some pretty strong requirements on banks. There were just standards that they had to meet, how much capital they had to have. They had to go through these stress tests. There just had to be a sense that a bank was able to survive. The banking lobbyists went at this immediately. They were up on Capitol Hill in 2011, 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. They kept asking for a loosening of it. And they found the vehicle to do it. Their vehicle to do it was to say that this Dodd-Frank bill was too tough, even though it really wasn't all that tough, but it was too tough on community banks. And when we think of community banks, you think of, I grew up in Union Grove, Wisconsin, a town of, 900 something when I was born. We had the State Bank of Union Grove. That was a community bank. It was, had a local board. It was, it was a pretty small bank, but it functioned. This isn't what they were lobbying for, though. They said community banks, but really they said, any bank that's got assets up to $250 billion, $250 billion. And that's what became this banking deregulation of 2018. They got the standards kind of loosened, in some cases wiped away, for any bank under a certain level. But those banks were very, very big banks. They were regional banks with a great deal of power, not the biggest banks in the country, but banks that, if they collapsed, could cause real structural problems, not just for themselves, but more broadly. And also, they became banks that focused on certain industries, as Silicon Valley Bank focused a lot on the tech industry, as Signature Bank had at least some vulnerability to crypto industries and that. And so they were vulnerable. They needed to face stress tests. They didn't face them. And so the bottom line is that banking deregulation of 2018, which Elizabeth Warren was talking about, it opened up the vulnerabilities within Dodd-Frank. It weakened Dodd-Frank, and it created a circumstance where banks could and did do irresponsible things without the level of oversight that they needed.
I mean, these aren't banks that are as large as Bank of America or Chase, but it's been reported that the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank is the second largest bank to have collapsed in history.
Yeah, and in history, if we look back, it's not often the biggest banks that collapse, right? It's banks on that food chain, ones that go down a little bit. But when you're talking about a bank with something close to $250 billion, right? That's a big bank, and that is also a bank, especially if, again, as I was saying before, if it focuses on a specific industry, on a specific area of the economy. If it goes down, then you have what we ended up with, which is a fear that if Silicon Valley Bank wasn't shored up, if there wasn't some sort of federal intervention very, very quickly, that it might bring down a broader industry or broader industries, the tech industry. Many of the things that we use on apps and that might be severely undermined very, very quickly. And because that's so now central to our economy, that you ended up in a situation very similar to 2008, where you had federal regulators and federal overseers saying, oh, we've got to intervene because if we don't, bigger, badder problems are going to occur. And so instead of having that protection that Dodd-Frank was supposed to give us, that we would never again have a too big to fail bank. A, you would have had the stress test, you would have made sure that you didn't get there in the first place. And B, if they did get there, right, you weren't going to have a circumstance where, there would have to be an urgent, immediate intervention by the federal government to prevent, something worse from happening. Well, we ended up in exactly where we were, not in as big a scope, but the same kind of problem. And it's because of this deregulation. And if I can add one final thing on it, it's important to understand that in 2018, we were warned. There were members of Congress who went to the floor, read the CBO, Congressional Budget Office analysis and recommendations into the record. They said, look, they're telling us if we make these deregulations, we're going to recreate many of the problems that we saw in 2008. Different structural problems, but the same basic concept that you have banks that if they fail could cause huge crisis. Well, we were warned. We, as a country, did not heed that warning. And now we find ourselves, you and I talking today at a time when people across this country are very, very worried about banks.
I want to go back to this Congressional Budget Office report 2018. This is a nonpartisan congressional organization, agency that looks at economic issues. And this is a report that was warning about what this measure can do. And this is an agency that was led at the time by a Republican director.
Yeah, look, this is the thing to understand about this is math, right? This is not theory. The bottom line is that if you've got a bank that is not operating in the right way, and when we talk about not operating in the right way, we can make it pretty clear. When you have a bad ratio as regards savings versus loans, when you have not taken basic steps to make sure that you have the resources you need so that if there is a run on the bank, you can have quick access to the funds that you need. When you haven't done those things, if you haven't done it, you're going to have a problem. The problem may not be immediate; it may occur at some point down the line, but it's real. Well, that's what we're talking about here. The CBO report said, just do the math. If we kind of loosen the standards on banks up to $250 billion, we're going to create vulnerabilities. And it didn't matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, liberal, or conservative, that should have been recognizable. The unfortunate reality is 50 Republican senators and 17 Democratic senators, including some very prominent Democrats, voted in favor of that deregulation. Over in the House, most Republicans, and I think it was 33 Democrats, voted for that deregulation. So you had strong bipartisan support for making a change that the CBO and other people warned us was a very bad idea.
I'm going to be repetitive here, but I'm going to quote the report. Again, it's simple. It says, increase the likelihood that a large financial firm with assets between 100 billion and 250 billion would fail. And that's exactly the number that the Silicon Valley Bank falls between.
Exactly. And, people like Dick Durbin and, Bernie Sanders especially. Bernie Sanders actually read the report on the floor of the Senate.
In 2018.
Yeah, in 2018. I apologize. And Elizabeth Warren was doing the same. there were members of Congress who were saying this is a bad idea. There were also academics who were outside Congress who were talking about it, including a professor named Katie Porter, who was not yet in Congress, but was actually talking about it at that time.
And this is her issue. She's been known for her role in congressional hearings and now running for Senate. But banking and banking regulation is actually her thing. Not so dissimilar from Elizabeth Warren.
Well, Katie Porter wrote the book on it. She literally wrote a book on this stuff. And in 2018, she can point to, statements she made saying, that it's pretty clear what will happen. And it did happen. Now, here's the subtlety of it. And I think when we do this blame game, and there is an element of the blame game, a lot of people are blaming Donald Trump. Trump approved the bill, right? But it's very important to know that the real action on this was on Capitol Hill. And the reason that action was on Capitol Hill is because there are certain industries, the pharmaceutical industry, the military industrial complex, and banking, that if you're a member of Congress, especially a prominent member of Congress, and you decide not to run for reelection, or you get beat for reelection, you're not going to be unemployed, right? They're going to come looking for you to be a lobbyist, and they pay a lot of money, and they give you a lot of support and send you up to Capitol Hill to speak in very kind, very gentle ways about how you want to protect, in this case, community banks, right? And that has influence. The money of the banking industry, both in campaign contributions and in the hiring of lots of influential lobbyists, create a circumstance where members of Congress didn't listen to the Congressional Budget Office, didn't listen to their own colleagues, didn't listen to academics, didn't listen to specialists on banking. They listened to the lobbyists for the banks. And the banks got what they wanted. But they also, with that, created a tremendous vulnerability. And then I know we'll talk about it in a little bit, but I'll say that also we did not have a Federal Reserve that was doing its job either. And so the whole thing started to get very, very weak and very vulnerable very quickly.
We did a program earlier this week with Maya Kornberg about her book on congressional committees, an exciting topic, but actually an important topic. And one of the things she brought up was, over the years, the cut in spending on congressional staff. These were going to be the experts on particular committees that were going to, know the issue that they're regulating and doing oversight of. And what you end up getting instead, when you have a reduction in staff, they end up being replaced by the expertise of the lobbyist.
That's right. I mean, this is not anything new, by the way. She's right that the crisis has become more severe in many cases. But if you go back to when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over in 1995 after the 1994 Republican Revolution election, one of the early complaints was that lobbyists were writing the bills. And they actually found evidence of situations where Republicans were literally sitting down with lobbyists and figuring out the language and stuff like this. And it was considered a scandal then. Today, it is so common that regulated industries are, if not at the table, they're standing, right over the table. They're right next to it, and they're clearly influencing legislation. And where it so often happens, Mitch, is in two areas: deregulation and oversight, the stuff we're talking about today. And it's very easy to argue for deregulation. You say, boy, this little rule, this simple little rule, it really makes it hard for banks to accumulate the capital they need to really help to jumpstart the economy, to do all sorts of good things. They can make all these arguments for it. And it becomes a powerful argument. You say, wow, really all we got to change is a couple words here, or change a number, raise the level to 250 billion for this. If we do that, like, all sorts of good things are going to happen. Yep, all sorts of good things are going to happen. And so the end result is that because you don't have a veteran staffer there who says, don't be silly, we've heard this before. This is the same lame argument they were making back in 1999 when we had banking deregulations that then led to problems in 2008. Don't do it because the lobbyists are, in fact, in many cases, more influential than the staffers. You create a situation where the lobbyists win. And it's also, I do have to say, though, it's on members of Congress. The fact of the matter is these members of Congress run for election, and they run, their campaigns become industries, right? They literally hire fundraisers and experts on getting money. They raise massive amounts of money from industries that they are supposed to oversee. And that's the second part of this, the loss of oversight. And instead of becoming, watchdogs, they essentially become lapdogs. They are literally waiting for the lobbyists to show up to say, here's an idea for how we could do this. And then they say, well, yeah, of course, I work with you guys. I'm ready to do it. And result is that we're talking today about banking. We could talk about the railroad industry, which we've seen some profound issues arise with East Palestine and other places. We can talk about, broader financial services. We can talk about, military contractors. The fact of the matter is we have created a situation in this country where there are whole industries that live off the largesse, if you will, of the federal government, or at least the generosity of the federal government, the benefit of the federal government, that are very, very wealthy, very, very powerful. They pile up tons of money. They use a tiny portion of that money for campaign contributions and a tiny portion of that money to hire lobbyists. And that then clears the way for them to make massively more money. And so I know we're talking about banking and we should remain focused on it and talk about Federal Reserve and other things. But I will tell you, in many ways, this is a campaign finance story. And a lobbying story.
And a lobbying story. I think the lobbying story is an important story, and how it affects other areas of regulations and regulatory, the regulatory world in general, because the nature of, regulatory work is complicated work. And then make it regulatory work over banking, it even becomes more complicated and hard to understand and opaque. And, there are some senators and representatives who have PhDs, and you don't have to have a PhD to be able to understand certain things. You can, but look, you run for office by shaking hands, kissing babies, and raising money. It's a terrible way to apply in addition for a job that's going to require you to overlook and think about issues around banking industry. And so again, what we have, the real experts on these issues are lobbyists. And as Maya Kornberg told me earlier this week, information is power.
It is of course power, and also the ability to analyze. Right, if you've got the resources to run the numbers and to look at stuff over time, you begin to understand how things work. Now with banking, because we're dealing with so much money, and we're dealing with the ability to make massively more money, you have lobbyists and others who figure out how to do what sounds like a minor change, and sounds like something, by the way, that you can make the media. And, a lot of the analysts say, wow, this just sounds great. It's a little change that's going to really free up a lot of the economy.
Well, people have favorable opinions towards community banks.
Of course I do. I mean, I still know the people who were the bankers in my small town when I grew up, right? Again, I grew up in a very small town. I knew Connie Martin. He was one of the bankers. My friend Mark Jansen's dad was the president of the bank, right? Now, the thing is, these people, these community bankers, in the old days, and even sometimes still in some small towns, especially in rural areas, they live in a house that's not much bigger than everybody else's house, right? They are part of the community. They may have a little more money, but they're not, they're not billionaires flying around in private jets. They are of the community. That's one thing. Even there, those bankers should be regulated. They should be subjected to stress tests. There's enough. I mean, it's not that hard to do this oversight, right? And banking inspectors, some states actually have pretty good banking inspection systems. But the community banker, you're right, people know, and people see in context. And one final thing, when that kind of community banker, the local banker, screws up, right? If they do something wrong and the local bank goes bad, right? It's maybe a problem for Union Grove, where I grew up. Maybe it's a problem for Western Racine County in Wisconsin. But boy, it's not it's not going to bring the national economy to a halt. And so they took that sympathy with that small town or that neighborhood bank, and they then applied it to banks that do have, incredibly wealthy CEOs, maybe even billionaires, who fly around in private jets and who, really kind of master the universe type folks. And again, when you're dealing with $250 billion or something in that amount, you're not, that's no classic community bank. And yet, this warping of the language, that's what got us into the situation. Not one of the things. I mean, we should look at all the factors, but that's one of the things that really got us into the situation that we're in now. And it's a bad situation, Mitch, because while Silicon Valley Bank has collapsed and while Signature Bank has collapsed, you saw what happened on Monday. They stopped trading on, a lot of regional banks, big regional banks, banks that people know the name of, because they saw similar vulnerabilities. May not be as bad, but clearly, something went wrong here. And the question is, Mitch, what are we going to do now when something has gone wrong? Are we going to just rush in and bail out the banks? Are we going to say, okay, now we have this new FDIC standard, right? Which is, used to be we insured assets up to a certain point, 250, well, it used to be less, but, around 250,000, something like that. No, now, if you're way above that, if you've got tens of millions in the bank and you wouldn't be protected by the FDIC, now they're saying, oh yeah, you will be, right? So we are now creating a situation where we are quote unquote backstopping. We don't call it a bailout, we call it backstopping people who put a lot of money into these banks. They're not necessarily bailing out the bank, but they are often, in this case, bailing out, major investors, very, very successful, financially successful people. If that's our new standard, Mitch, you're going to see much more of this, right? Because banks, people are no longer going to have a sense of, oh, you got to be careful where you put your money. You got to think about it and stuff like that. And I think one thing people are missing right now is that we are redefining what the FDIC is. And we are defining it in a much kind of more Wild West way than it was, even a few weeks ago.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with John Nichols. He has a piece in The Nation magazine called Bankers Lobbied for Deregulation, Congress Capitulated, and now banks are collapsing. We are talking about the deregulatory process of the banking industry in recent years. Tell me more about that dynamic of FDIC and its shift and its change. Is this something that can happen without congressional approval? Is this something that can happen on its own? Do they have the authority? Yeah.
I mean, you're right, Mitch, to ask if this is something that can happen without congressional approval, because this is a gray area, and we're kind of falling into some of the same traps we fell into in 2008. In an emergency situation where you are afraid that the broader economy could get into real trouble, suddenly a lot of the rules go out the window, and people have become very, very flexible on what they're going to do. And they always tell you, well, this is a specific urgent response to one problem. But we've effectively set a new standard. We have said to people who had, huge amounts of money in Silicon Valley Bank, government's going to make you whole. Now, in many ways, that certainly feels good, because that means that folks can make payroll for some pretty big operations. It means that they can continue to operate. Stock market stabilizes, and the stock market kind of stabilized pretty quickly after this. But one of the reasons is that you suddenly had the federal government basically saying, we're going to provide a cushion for a lot of very wealthy people to make sure that they don't suffer at all as a result of this circumstance. And again, I'm not running around saying, oh, I want everybody to suffer or something like that. But what I would say is that we desperately need to, pull the brake here and say, what are we doing with the FDIC? Are we making it now a guarantor for money in the bank of any amount, right? Huge amounts of money. If we are, then the next bank that collapses, if it's not incredibly well, if we don't start to do regulatory reform, the next bank that collapses could create a demand for massively more money. And wise analysts have been saying for a long time that we need to reform the FDIC. We need to set standards that will protect working class and middle class families that have money in the bank, and that will, in general, provide a level of security that's necessary. Understand that. So that's good. So you need that reform. But this isn't that reform. This is kind of going the other direction. And if you do not have an immediate effort to overturn the 2018 deregulation, and to get the Federal Reserve to do much better oversight as regards the banking industry, then you have this situation where you've opened up a big new vulnerability with the FDIC. So you want to change how the FDIC operates, maybe even raise the amount that is guaranteed, stuff like that. You have to couple it with re-regulation and increased oversight. If you don't, you're just, you're really opening the door to a potential crisis that could cost the U.S. taxpayers and others massive amounts of money.
What is the FDIC? We've all heard of it. We all think of it as our money being, guaranteed under $250,000 in the bank. But I wonder how many of us, including myself, really even understands what it is.
Well, we can Google it. The fact of the matter is the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is something that goes back to the early era of banking regulation and banking reform, because we went in the 1930s, right? We had a situation where, and I can give you the example, my grandmother in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, raced to the bank in 1929 when the stock market, which you heard on the radio, the stock market was going down and things were getting shaky. She was there in line at the bank, right, to get her money out.
Yeah.
Well, people do that, right?
How would you compare and contrast this, what we're talking about, the dynamic that's happened in a few years, and something that really stood out to me that you said earlier, that this was a lobbying effort that occurred year after year after year after year after the Dodd-Frank bill was put in place. And again, you pointed out that it's not necessarily that Dodd-Frank would have prevented all of this from happening. But this further deregulation that happened in 2018 specifically was talking about these banks that we're talking about who have collapsed recently. How would you compare and contrast that to what happened with Glass-Steagall? Glass-Steagall is a banking law from the New Deal era that separated your more traditional banks from investment banks. I mean, that took a lot more lobbying than I suppose happened in this most recent time, because that happened over decades. But finally, it was in the 90s under a Clinton administration that this finally did get repealed. And of course, we were talking a ton about Glass-Steagall after the collapse of 2008.
Yeah. Well, one of the things to understand about Glass-Steagall was that Glass-Steagall was a bill from the 1930s that kind of put a wall between what banks could do as regards, classic banking, and what they could do with financial speculation, financial, money making outside of the banking, the classic banking zone. So it was what we saw in the late 1990s with the upturning of Glass-Steagall was a freeing up of financial institutions to do a lot more than traditional banking. And when you took that wall down, then you got banks into a vulnerable place, because they were, they got the face of the traditional bank, but now they're over into all these areas of effectively speculation, right? Or at least, allowing people to play with money in much more adventurous ways. And so really what the Glass-Steagall reforms of the late 1990s did was it did something fascinating. It made the banker, instead of the dull suit and tie guy, right, or woman who's very, very proper, kind of followed all the rules, dotted all the T's, into this high-flying, like master of the universe financial wizard, right? and you saw what happened, right? Where you had, especially with mortgage guarantees and mortgage funds, where they were creating investment vehicles that were absurd, right? That were by their very nature vulnerable. And because you'd taken down that wall, then that vulnerability then threatened the banks as well. So that was where the problem with Glass-Steagall is. What happened in 2018 was a very, very different thing, right? It was it still got into that regulatory area, but now you're talking about, just making sure that allowing banks not to have the same standards if they were a little bit smaller, right? If you were like a so-called community bank, but you had 250 billion. And again, when you do these things, and when they did it with Glass-Steagall, when they did it with, in 2018, it is that deregulation of the banks which then creates a vulnerability. Now, you can do it in different ways and it has different impacts, but that vulnerability is still real. And then that takes us back to our friends at the FDIC, right? Because, and you were asking before about, how the baseline of the FDIC operates. And the core thing to understand, the baseline is that banks really like having the FDIC. And so they pay fees in, right? They pay for that insurance. The banks pay for the insurance, and that's the FDIC money. But Mitch, when you're talking about now creating this much bigger vulnerability, then suddenly that's where the taxpayers potentially are on the hook. And when you do stuff like this, what you ought to do, whether you're doing the Glass-Steagall reforms in the late 1990s, or whether you are doing the deregulation of 2018, is you should ask yourself, are we prepared for what might come of this? And the bottom line is, I think there's a lot of evidence that we're not prepared. And again, we haven't talked a lot about the Federal Reserve, but I will tell you that the Federal Reserve has a big role in this as well, because they're supposed to, provide a lot of direction and oversight and have their own role here. And it's pretty clear that Jerome Powell was, he took actions that were necessarily going to have consequences, and they did have consequences as regards with interest rates and things like that. And I'm not disagreeing with what he might do with interest rates, but what I'm telling you is when you do that, you should be charting out what the unintended consequences of that may be. And I don't think they've done enough of that. And I guess,
there was very little attention, and not many people have connected this to the massive job layoffs that occurred in the tech industry and earlier in the year.
Well, and they're still occurring right now. And so, there's one of the things is I read a lot about economies in other countries, in Germany and Scandinavia and places like that. And they often talk about a planned economy, i.e. that there's a lot of scoping out of where things are going to go, doing analyses of, if you take this action, what's going to happen in that regard, and some more effort to make sure that you don't fall into traps, so things don't happen that are unexpected but incredibly dangerous. We do not do the level of planning in this country. We don't do it at the legislative level when we're passing a bill. And then once we have passed a bill, we don't do it at the oversight level. End result is that our banking system in this country has vulnerabilities. And we're expecting the FDIC, which is, an insurance agency, right, to cover that vulnerability. It can't if we really hit the big wall here. And so this is what Congress ought to do. They ought to go back and they ought to get rid of that 2018 deregulation. It was a bad idea. They may keep some elements of it, but they should really rework that. They ought to look at FDIC reform and a lot of structural, oversight of how that works, and think of it, if you want to keep it working the same way it does. And finally, there has to be dramatically more congressional oversight of the Federal Reserve. And we just don't have a sufficient level of oversight of the Federal Reserve. And so, you have the people become chair of the Federal Reserve who become effectively, again, their own kind of master of the universe. They're deciding what to do, and they're supposed to be geniuses and know what they're doing. Well, the Federal Reserve is a part of our current problem, and it ought to be, subject to oversight. And
we'll always remember we have the tyranny of the clock, but we'll always remember Alan Greenspan's infamous words in front of a congressional committee, is that basically his worldview was wrong. So,
yeah, I know. And when they're wrong, that's a really big wrong.
Yeah. John Nichols has been our guest. Again, his latest piece at The Nation magazine is called Bankers Lobbied for Deregulation. Congress Capitulated, and now banks are collapsing. You, of course, can read it at thenation.com. John Nichols, thank you so much.
Thank you.